The phone rang at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, which should have been my first warning. Nobody calls with good news that late, especially not on an encrypted line I didn't even know I had. Leroy Vasquez. The voice was crisp, professional, female. The kind of voice that belonged to someone who wore expensive suits and never had to check her bank balance. Yeah, that's me. I sat up in bed, instantly awake. 23 years of commercial diving had taught me that late-night calls usually meant someone was in trouble. Who's this? Agent Caitlin Kim, Department of Oceanic Research. I have a proposition for you, Mr. Vasquez. Department of what now? I'd worked with NOAA, the Navy, even some private research outfits, but I'd never heard of any Department of Oceanic Research. Look, lady, if this is about the Meridian job last month, I already filed my report with. This isn't about previous work. We need your services for a new project. Are you familiar with the Mariana Trench? I rubbed my eyes. Of course. Deepest part of the ocean. What's that got to do with me? We've discovered a new trench formation in the Pacific. Preliminary surveys suggest it extends beyond 7 miles in depth. We need an experienced diver for immediate exploration. 7 miles. I felt my stomach drop. The deepest I'd ever gone was 3.5 miles, and that was in a military-grade atmospheric suit that cost more than my house. 7 miles is... That's not really diving anymore. That's more like space travel in reverse. Your safety record and technical expertise make you uniquely qualified for this mission. The compensation would be $200,000 for a single dive. I nearly dropped the phone. 200 grand? For one dive? That was more than I'd made in the last 3 years combined. What's the catch? No catch. Simply a matter of national security requiring immediate attention. National security. Right. Because nothing said routine geological survey like calling it a matter of national security at midnight. Who else have you talked to about this job? A pause, just long enough to make me nervous. Other divers were unavailable for the mission timeline. Unavailable. Not unqualified. Not busy. Unavailable. In the diving world, there were only a few reasons someone became unavailable that fast. None of them were good. What kind of timeline are we talking about? Departure Monday morning. You'll have 48 hours to decide. Monday? That's 5 days from now. For a 7-mile dive, I'd need at least 2 weeks of preparation, pressure training, equipment checks. All equipment will be provided. Military-grade atmospheric diving suit, full life support systems, emergency protocols. You would simply need to operate the equipment and document your findings. Simply. Like going 7 miles underwater was the same as taking a walk around the block. What exactly am I supposed to be documenting down there? Geological formations, mineral deposits, any unusual features of the trench structure. Standard deep-sea survey work. Standard. Sure. Standard deep-sea survey work that paid 10 times the normal rate and required encrypted phone calls at midnight. I'm going to need more details before I agree to anything. The mission is classified under federal guidelines. Specific details can only be shared after you sign the necessary non-disclosure agreements. And there it was. The real hook. Sign the papers first. Ask questions later. I'd seen this dance before with government contracts, but never for anything this big. What happens if I say no? Another pause. Longer this time. Given the classified nature of this conversation, you would need to undergo a mandatory debriefing to ensure operational security. Mandatory debriefing. Government speak for, we'll make your life difficult until you forget this conversation ever happened. I looked around my apartment, the stack of unpaid bills on the kitchen counter, the eviction notice I'd been ignoring for 2 weeks, the photo of Sophia at her college graduation that I'd paid for with a second mortgage. $200,000 would solve everything. Pay off the house, catch up on Sophia's tuition, maybe even have enough left over to fix the transmission in my truck. But 7 miles down, that was deeper than any human had ever gone and lived to talk about it. Why me specifically? There are divers with more experience in extreme depth work. Your psychological profile indicates strong performance under pressure and minimal likelihood of mission compromise. Psychological profile. When the hell had the government been studying my psychological profile? I never took any psychological tests for the government. Background checks are standard for all federal contractors, Mr. Vasquez. Your military service record, civilian diving certifications, and personal history all indicate you're suitable for this type of work. Personal history. They'd been digging into my personal life, probably knew about the divorce, the financial problems, maybe even knew I'd been desperate enough to take increasingly dangerous jobs just to keep my head above water. They knew exactly how much I needed this money. The trench location. Where exactly are we talking about? Pacific coordinates will be provided upon contract signing. The dive site is approximately 4 hours by helicopter from San Diego. 4 hours by helicopter meant we were talking about deep ocean, far from any shipping lanes or rescue operations. If something went wrong down there, I'd be on my own. What kind of support crew? Full technical team. Dive coordinator, communications specialist, medical personnel. Everything necessary for a safe operation. Everything necessary for a safe operation 7 miles underwater, where the pressure would crush a human body in milliseconds without proper protection, where no rescue was possible if the equipment failed, where whatever they expected me to find was important enough to risk a civilian's life. I thought about Sophia's last phone call, how she'd tried to hide the worry in her voice when she asked if I was okay financially, how she'd offered to drop out of school and get a job to help with expenses. My 19-year-old daughter, offering to sacrifice her future because her old man couldn't keep his finances together. I need to think about it. Of course. You have 48 hours. I'll send you the preliminary contract documents for review. Your secure phone will receive the coordinates and departure details once you've made your decision. Secure phone. I looked down at the device in my hand. It looked like my regular cell phone, but now that I thought about it, I didn't remember buying this particular model. How did you get this number? We'll be in touch, Mr. Vasquez. Have a good evening. The line went dead. I stared at the phone for a long moment, then checked the call log. No record of the conversation. No incoming call listed at all. I walked to the kitchen and poured myself 3 fingers of bourbon, then sat at the table with the stack of bills. Past due notices from the mortgage company, the electric company, Sophia's school. The eviction notice that gave me 30 days to come up with 6 months of back rent, $200,000, enough to fix everything, start over, maybe even retire from the dangerous diving jobs that were slowly killing me anyway. All I had to do was go 7 miles underwater to a place no human had ever been, document whatever the government expected me to find, and trust that their equipment wouldn't fail when I was too far down for any rescue. The phone buzzed. A text message with an attachment. A contract document labeled Preliminary Terms, Classified Operation. I opened the file. The first page was mostly legal boilerplate, but the compensation section was clear enough. $200,000 upon successful completion of dive mission. The second page outlined the non-disclosure requirements. The third page made it clear that backing out after signing would result in federal prosecution. The fourth page listed the dive depth, 7.3 miles. I finished the bourbon and poured another. Outside, Miami traffic hummed through the night, people going about their normal lives without worrying about mysterious government agents or impossible diving jobs. People who didn't have to choose between financial ruin and risking their lives in the deepest parts of the ocean. My phone buzzed again. Another text. Decision required by Thursday, 11:59 p.m. Departure Monday, 0600 hours, San Diego. Come alone. Come alone. Because nothing about this job sounded suspicious at all. I looked at Sophia's graduation photo again. She was smiling, proud, holding her diploma like it represented everything she'd worked for. Everything I'd helped her work for, even when it meant taking jobs that scared the hell out of me. The smart thing would be to say no. Walk away, find some other solution to my money problems, maybe sell the house and start over somewhere cheaper. The smart thing would be to trust my instincts, which were screaming that Agent Kim and her Department of Oceanic Research were hiding something big. But smart decisions didn't pay for college tuition or keep the lights on. Smart decisions didn't solve the kind of problems that required $200,000 in immediate cash. I opened my laptop and started researching the Department of Oceanic Research. After an hour of searching, I found exactly nothing. No website, no budget listings, no congressional oversight records. Either they were so classified that they didn't exist on paper, or they didn't exist at all. Both possibilities worried me. The phone buzzed one more time. A final text with GPS coordinates and a single line. Coordinates valid for 48 hours only. Confirm by Thursday or consider this conversation terminated. I stared at those coordinates for a long time. Somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, 7 miles down, something was waiting that the government thought was worth risking a civilian diver's life to investigate. Something important enough to pay 10 times the normal rate and surround with enough secrecy to make my head spin. Against every instinct I'd developed in 23 years of commercial diving, I started typing my response. The helicopter's rotors cut through the morning air like angry wasps, and I pressed my face against the small window to watch San Diego shrink below us. 3 days of thinking hadn't made this decision feel any smarter, but the check in my pocket for $50,000, half the advance payment, felt real enough. Agent Kim sat across from me in the cramped passenger compartment, a black briefcase handcuffed to her wrist. She looked exactly like she'd sounded on the phone. Expensive suit, perfect posture, the kind of person who probably ironed her underwear. She opened the briefcase and slid a thick stack of papers across the narrow table between us. "Final contracts," she said, raising her voice over the engine noise. "Standard liability waivers, equipment responsibility agreements, and mission-specific non-disclosure addendums." I flipped through the pages. More legal language than I could process, but the compensation section was clear. $150,000 on completion, bringing my total to $200,000. What happens if I don't complete the mission? Equipment failure, weather conditions, or other circumstances beyond your control wouldn't affect payment. However, abandoning the mission due to personal reluctance would void the contract entirely. Personal reluctance, like getting scared 7 miles underwater, was some kind of character flaw. I signed the papers anyway, because Sophia's tuition bill wasn't going to pay itself. The flight stretched on for what felt like forever. Kim spent most of it typing on a tablet, occasionally glancing at me like she was taking notes for some kind of psychological evaluation. After 2 hours, she finally put the device away and leaned forward. "Let me introduce you to your surface support team." She pulled out a folder with personnel files. "Tyler Woods will be your dive coordinator, 28 years Navy experience, including submarine rescue operations. He'll monitor your descent and guide you through any technical issues." She showed me a photo of a guy who looked like he'd been carved out of granite. Buzz cut, pale eyes, the kind of face that had never smiled at a joke. And Skylar Calhoun handles communications. MIT graduate, specializes in deep water radio systems. The second photo showed a younger guy with messy hair and thick glasses, the type who probably knew more about electronics than human conversation. Both men looked competent enough, but something about their official photos bothered me. Too posed, like corporate headshots instead of crew documentation. Will I get to talk with them before the dive? Of course. They're already aboard the research vessel running final equipment checks. The helicopter began descending toward a speck on the horizon that gradually resolved into a ship. Research vessel Neptune looked like someone had taken a military destroyer and bolted every piece of scientific equipment they could find onto the deck. Cranes, winches, satellite dishes, and what looked like enough diving gear to outfit a small navy. We touched down on a landing platform that took up most of the ship's stern. The moment I stepped out, 2 men approached us across the deck. Woods looked even more intimidating in person, tall, wiry, with the kind of posture that screamed military discipline. Calhoun seemed nervous, constantly adjusting his glasses and fidgeting with some kind of electronic device clipped to his belt. "Mr. Vasquez," Woods said, extending a hand. His grip felt like a vice. "Welcome aboard. We're ready to begin your mission briefing." I shook hands with Calhoun, who barely made eye contact. "Nice to meet you. I've been looking forward to working with someone of your experience." Something felt off about both of them. Woods answered my questions about the dive profile with technical specifications that sounded rehearsed, while Calhoun kept glancing at Kim like he was waiting for permission to speak. When I asked about emergency procedures, they exchanged a look that lasted just a second too long. Kim led us below deck to a room that looked more like a command center than anything you'd find on a research vessel. Banks of monitors, communication equipment, and what appeared to be military-grade sonar systems. "This is where we'll monitor your dive. Every aspect of your descent will be tracked and recorded." Woods gestured toward a door at the far end of the room. "Your equipment is in the next compartment. We should run through the suit systems before you get some rest." The atmospheric diving suit hung from a support frame like some kind of deep-sea armor. I'd used similar models before, but this one was different, sleeker, with additional life support modules and equipment I didn't recognize. The helmet alone probably cost more than my truck. "This is military prototype technology," Woods explained, running his hand along the suit's arm. "Rated for depths exceeding 8 miles. Multiple redundant life support systems, emergency ascent capability, and enhanced communication arrays." I noticed someone had carefully removed all the manufacturer labels. Every piece of equipment that should have had identifying marks or serial numbers had been stripped clean. "Who made this?" "Classified contractor," Kim said. "The important thing is that it's been tested extensively at extreme depths." I walked around the suit, checking joints and seals. The craftsmanship was incredible, but something nagged at me. Tested by who? I've never heard of anyone going this deep in an atmospheric suit. Woods and Calhoun exchanged another one of those looks. "Test data is classified," Woods said, "but I can assure you the equipment is reliable." Calhoun stepped forward, pointing to various displays built into the suit's chest panel. "You'll have full sonar mapping, water temperature monitoring, and geological sampling equipment. The suit's computer will log everything automatically." I peered closer at the displays. Mixed in with the standard diving instruments were devices I'd never seen before. Biometric monitors, what looked like brain activity sensors, and several small cameras positioned to record not just the environment, but the inside of the helmet. "What's all this monitoring equipment for?" "Safety protocols," Kim said quickly. "At extreme depths, we need to track your physiological responses to ensure the dive remains within safe parameters. Safety protocols that included filming my face throughout the dive. I'd worked enough government contracts to recognize surveillance equipment when I saw it. They weren't just monitoring my safety. They were studying me." Woods handed me a waterproof tablet. Mission profile and dive coordinates. You'll descend to 7.3 miles, conduct a geological survey of the trench floor, and collect specimens as directed by the surface team. I scrolled through the information. The target depth was insane. Deeper than Mount Everest was tall in reverse. The coordinates put us in the middle of nowhere, hundreds of miles from the nearest shipping lane. What kind of specimens are we looking for? Geological samples primarily, Kim said. Rock formations, mineral deposits, any unusual features of the trench structure. Unusual features. Right. Because normal geological surveys required this level of secrecy and experimental equipment. How long do you expect me to stay on the bottom? Approximately 4 hours, Woods replied. Enough time for comprehensive documentation and sample collection. 4 hours at 7 miles depth. Even with the best equipment, that was pushing the limits of what any atmospheric suit could handle. The power requirements alone would drain most battery systems, and the pressure stress on the hull would be enormous. I followed them back topside to watch the crew prepare the diving platform. The sun was starting to set, painting the ocean in shades of orange and red. But as we approached the coordinates, I noticed the water looked wrong. Instead of the normal deep blue of open ocean, it appeared almost black, like we were floating over a massive shadow. Is that normal? I asked, pointing at the dark water. Calhoun looked where I was pointing and shrugged. Deep ocean trenches often appear darker due to light absorption and mineral content. Maybe, but I'd dived in plenty of deep water before, and I'd never seen anything quite like this. The darkness seemed to move, shifting patterns that might have been currents, or might have been something else entirely. Kim appeared at my elbow, holding another set of papers. Final mission briefing. Communication protocols require you to report everything you observe during the dive. No matter how small or insignificant it might seem, we need complete documentation. Everything I observed. They really wanted to know what was down there, badly enough to risk sending a civilian diver to depths that had never been explored, badly enough to pay 10 times the normal rate and surround the whole operation with enough secrecy to make my head spin. The crew finished setting up the diving platform as the last light faded from the sky. Floodlights illuminated the work area, casting harsh shadows across the deck. Woods checked his watch and nodded to Kim. We'll begin descent at 0800 hours tomorrow, he announced. Mr. Vasquez, I suggest you get some rest. It's going to be a long day. I stared out at the black water one more time before heading below deck. Somewhere beneath us, 7 miles down in the deepest part of the ocean, something waited that the government thought was worth risking my life to investigate. Something important enough to build experimental diving equipment and recruit a desperate civilian who couldn't afford to ask too many questions. Whatever it was, I'd find out tomorrow morning. The suit sealed around me with a series of mechanical clicks that sounded way too final, like a coffin lid closing. Woods ran through the final systems check while I tried to ignore the knot forming in my stomach. The atmospheric pressure inside felt perfect. The life support hummed quietly, and all the displays showed green. Everything looked good on paper. Radio check, Woods said through my helmet speakers, loud and clear topside. Excellent. Beginning descent sequence in 30 seconds. I looked through the helmet's faceplate at the black water below. Even with the ship's floodlights, the ocean looked like it was swallowing light instead of reflecting it. Something about that darkness bothered me more than the depth we were heading for. The crane lifted my suit from the platform and swung me out over the water. For a moment, I hung suspended between the ship's lights and the endless black below, feeling like an offering about to be dropped into some ancient well. Initiating descent, Woods announced. The winch released and I dropped into the Pacific at exactly 0800 hours. The first sensation was always the same. That moment when the ocean closes over your head and suddenly you're in a completely different world. The ship's lights faded quickly as I sank, replaced by the suit's external floods that carved a small bubble of visibility in the darkness. Depth 20 feet, I reported. All systems nominal. Copy that. Maintain descent rate at 15 feet per minute. The sunlight zone passed in a blur of blue-green water. Schools of fish scattered from my lights, their silver bodies flashing like coins thrown into a fountain. This was the part I usually enjoyed, the transition from surface chaos to underwater calm. But today the fish seemed wrong somehow, moving in patterns that looked more like fleeing than normal swimming. At 200 feet, I hit the thermocline. The water temperature dropped 10 degrees in as many feet, and my suit's heating system kicked in automatically. Through the helmet speakers, I could hear Calhoun typing on his keyboard, probably updating some kind of log. Entering Twilight Zone, I announced as I passed 600 feet. This was where things usually got interesting. Bioluminescent creatures started appearing. Jellyfish like living Christmas ornaments. Squid with light patterns that pulsed across their bodies. Deep-sea fish with glowing lures. The ocean's midnight shift coming alive. But as I kept descending, I noticed something strange. The usual light show was there, but it seemed muted, like someone had turned down the brightness. The jellyfish moved sluggishly, and the squid kept their distance from my lights instead of investigating with their normal curiosity. 1,000 feet, I reported. Suit pressure stable, life support green across the board. Roger. How's visibility? I looked around at the sparse collection of glowing creatures. Clearer than expected. Marine life seems subdued. Normal for this location, Woods replied. Deep ocean trenches often have reduced biodiversity. Maybe, but I'd worked plenty of deep sites before. This felt different. The water itself seemed heavier, thicker somehow, like it was resisting my descent. At 3,000 feet, I was deep enough that the water pressure outside would crush me instantly without the suit. The atmospheric diving system kept me at surface pressure, but I could feel the ocean's weight pressing against the titanium hull. Every joint, every seal, every connection point was holding back enough force to implode a submarine. 3 miles down, I announced, switching to deep water sonar. I activated the suit's mapping system and immediately got readings that made no sense. The sonar showed contacts moving below me, large objects that appeared and disappeared like ghosts. When I adjusted the frequency, the contacts vanished completely. Topside, I'm getting weird sonar readings. Multiple large contacts at varying depths, but they're not consistent. Calhoun's voice crackled through the speakers. That's normal thermal layer interference, Leroy. The temperature gradients down there can create false returns. Just ignore the phantom contacts and focus on your descent. Phantom contacts. Right. Except I'd been using sonar equipment for 20 years, and I knew the difference between thermal interference and solid returns. These readings looked like something was moving down there. I kept descending, trying to shake off the feeling that I was being watched. At 4 miles depth, my external lights started acting up, flickering on and off in patterns that definitely weren't normal. The backup lighting system kicked in automatically, bathing everything in a dimmer red glow that made the water look like blood. Topside, I've got lighting issues. Main floods are cycling on and off. Copy that, Woods replied. Backup systems are functioning normally. Continue descent. Continue descent. Sure, no problem. Just keep going down into the deepest part of the ocean with failing equipment and sonar contacts that might or might not be there. What could go wrong? The water around me had turned completely black now, empty of the marine life I usually encountered at these depths. No giant squid, no deep-sea fish, no scavenging crabs. just darkness so complete that my lights seemed to be absorbed rather than reflected. At 5 miles, my descent rate started slowing as the suit's systems worked harder to maintain pressure equilibrium. The hull creaked occasionally, tiny adjustments as the titanium compressed under the enormous weight above me. Each sound made me think about just how far I was from the surface, from help, from anything resembling safety. 5 miles and descending, I reported. Suit systems working harder but still within normal parameters. Excellent progress. Kim's voice joined the conversation. You're making better time than anticipated. Better time to what? I wanted to ask, but something in her tone suggested that questions weren't welcome right now. At 6 miles depth, both my main and backup sonar systems failed simultaneously. Instead of the normal ping and return display, I got a constant low-frequency buzz that made communication difficult and set my teeth on edge. Topside, I've lost all sonar capability, getting constant interference on all frequencies. Woods' voice came through the static. Roger that. We can track your position via satellite relay. Continue descent to target depth. Continue descent without sonar, with failing lights, in water that felt wrong in ways I couldn't explain. The professional thing to do would be to abort the mission and surface for equipment checks. But the professional thing wouldn't pay Sophia's tuition or keep my house out of foreclosure. I checked my depth gauge, 6.2 miles. The numbers seemed impossible. I was deeper than any human had ever gone and lived to tell about it, descending toward a part of the ocean that existed in permanent darkness and crushing pressure. My pressure readings started showing minor fluctuations that seemed inconsistent with the steady descent. The numbers were within normal parameters for this depth, but they kept shifting in small increments that suggested my sensors were struggling with the extreme conditions. Either my equipment was being affected by the depth, or there were unusual thermal layers interfering with the readings. Topside. My pressure readings are showing minor fluctuations. Sensors seem to be struggling with the extreme depth conditions. That's normal sensor drift at extreme depth? Calhoun's voice crackled through the interference. The pressure sensors can fluctuate when they're operating at their maximum range. Your depth readings are solid. Continue descent. Trust my depth readings. Trust the equipment. Trust the people on the surface who were telling me to ignore every warning sign my experience was screaming about. The main tether cable connecting me to the surface started vibrating strangely, creating unusual drag that made descending more difficult. Instead of the normal steady tension, the cable jerked and twisted like something was pulling on it from below. At 7.1 miles, my suit's internal temperature dropped without warning. The heating system should have compensated automatically, but instead, I felt genuine cold seeping through the hull. My breath started fogging the faceplate, something that shouldn't happen with properly functioning life support. Internal temperature dropping, I reported. Life support systems not responding normally. Thermal regulation can be affected by extreme depth, Woods replied. Your systems are within acceptable parameters. Approach target depth and prepare for bottom contact. Acceptable parameters. Everything was within acceptable parameters, according to the surface team. The failing sonar, the flickering lights, the impossible pressure readings, the temperature drop, all perfectly normal for a dive that no human had ever attempted before. 7.2 miles down, I could see the trench floor rising to meet me through the red glow of my backup lights. The bottom looked strange in the red light, smoother than I expected, though it was hard to make out details through the dim backup illumination. Bottom contact in 30 feet, I announced. Roger. Begin geological survey upon touchdown. Document everything you observe. Document everything. Sure thing. Starting with the fact that everything about this dive had gone wrong from the moment I hit the water, and the surface team seemed more interested in pushing me forward than addressing the equipment failures. My suit touched down on the trench floor with a soft thud that vibrated through the hull. 7.2 miles beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean, farther from sunlight and safety than any human had ever traveled. And that's when I saw the first skeleton. The suit's external floods swept across the trench floor, revealing sediment so uniform it looked like someone had taken a massive rake to the entire area. No scattered rocks, no debris fields, no natural formations, just smooth mud stretching beyond my light range. "Bottom contact confirmed," I reported. 7.2 miles depth, beginning geological survey. Woods' voice crackled through the static. "Roger that. Proceed to coordinates Alpha 7 for initial sample collection." I activated the suit's propulsion system and moved forward, following the navigation display toward the target area. The bottom felt wrong under my feet, too soft, like walking on flour instead of the packed sediment I expected at this depth. That's when my lights caught the first bone. At first glance, I figured whale skeleton. Deep ocean was full of them, massive carcasses that sank to the bottom and fed scavenger communities for decades. But as I got closer, the proportions looked off. The skull was enormous, nearly 3 feet across, but the bone structure looked almost human. Elongated jaw, massive eye sockets, but definitely humanoid features. Topside, I've got skeletal remains at the target coordinates. Large specimen, possibly whale, but the bone structure is unusual. Kim's voice cut through the interference immediately. "Document everything with your suit cameras. Provide detailed descriptions of all skeletal features." I activated the recording system and moved closer to examine the skull. The bone was ancient, covered in the kind of deep-sea sediment that took centuries to accumulate. But the features were impossible to ignore. This thing had looked human, just scaled up to impossible proportions. "Skull measures approximately 36 inches across," I reported. "Bone structure appears humanoid but greatly enlarged. Jaw extension suggests carnivorous adaptation." Moving around the skeleton, I could see it was complete and articulated. 15 feet from skull to pelvis, with arm bones that would have given it a reach longer than my entire body. The ribcage could have housed a small car. Complete skeleton present. Estimated length 15 feet. Bone structure consistent with bipedal locomotion. I followed my navigation display toward the next coordinate and found another skeleton. Then another. Each one positioned deliberately, all facing the same direction like they were part of some kind of formation. "Multiple skeletal remains," I announced. 7 complete specimens so far, arranged in what appears to be a circular pattern. Calhoun's voice joined the conversation. "Can you determine the species? Any identifying characteristics?" "Species. Right. Like there was some classification system for 15-foot humanoid skeletons found 7 miles underwater." I moved from skeleton to skeleton, documenting each one with the suit's cameras. They were all identical in size and structure, all positioned facing inward towards something I couldn't see yet. All specimens show identical bone structure. Positioning suggests deliberate arrangement rather than natural deposition. Kim's voice carried a new urgency. "Document any markings or symbols on the bone surfaces. Look for carved or etched features." I focused my lights on the nearest skull and immediately saw what she meant. Carved into the forehead were symbols that definitely weren't natural, geometric patterns that looked almost like writing. The markings were deep enough to have survived whatever process had cleaned the bones. Confirmed markings on skull surfaces, carved symbols, geometric patterns. Appears to be intentional modification. Moving to the center of the circular formation, I found what all the skeletons were facing: a depression in the trench floor, roughly 50 feet across and dropping another 20 feet below the surrounding bottom. The pit looked artificial, too perfectly round to be natural. Central depression located. Circular formation, approximately 50 feet diameter, 20 feet deep. All skeletal remains positioned facing this feature. Wood's voice came through the static. Descend into the depression. Document any additional features or specimens. I looked down into the pit. My lights couldn't penetrate to the bottom from this angle, but something about the perfect circular shape made my skin crawl. Everything about this site felt deliberate, arranged, like I was looking at some kind of underwater graveyard. Roger. Beginning descent into central depression. I activated my suit's vertical thrusters and dropped into the pit. The walls were smooth, almost polished, definitely not natural erosion. As I descended, my lights revealed more bones scattered across the bottom, smaller skeletons that looked like juvenile versions of the giants above. Additional skeletal remains in the depression. Smaller specimens, possibly juvenile forms. Bone scatter suggests multiple individuals. The bottom of the pit was littered with bones of various sizes. Some looked like they might have been human-sized originally. Others were clearly the same species as the giants, but much younger. All of them showed the same ancient sediment coating, meaning this site had been undisturbed for an incredibly long time. Specimen count in depression exceeds 20 individuals. Age range from juvenile to adult forms. All bones show extensive sediment accumulation. I used the suit's collection arms to gather samples from several different skeletons, storing them in the specimen containers built into my equipment. Each bone felt heavier than it should, denser than normal human remains. Kim's voice cut through my concentration. Describe the arrangement of remains in the depression. Any patterns or organizational structure? I swept my lights across the bone field again. Unlike the organized circle above, these skeletons were scattered randomly, like they'd been dumped rather than placed. Some were complete, others just fragments, all mixed together in a chaotic pile. No organized pattern in the depression. Remains appear randomly distributed, possibly indicating rapid deposition rather than ceremonial placement. The more I looked at the site, the more questions multiplied in my head. What were these things? How had they gotten 7 miles underwater? And why had the government sent me down here to find them? Sample collection complete, I reported, requesting permission to expand search area. Woods' response came immediately. Negative. Maintain position and continue documentation of current site. Continue documentation. Right. Like there was more to document than the impossible fact that I was standing in an underwater graveyard filled with giant humanoid skeletons that shouldn't exist. I activated my suit's sonar to map the surrounding area and immediately got readings that made no sense. The display showed additional formations beyond my light range, more circular depressions, more organized patterns that suggested this wasn't an isolated site. Sonar indicates additional formations beyond visual range, multiple circular features consistent with current site structure. Kim's voice carried new tension. Focus on your immediate area. Complete documentation of all visible specimens before expanding survey. Something in her tone suggested they knew exactly what I was going to find down here. This wasn't a geological survey. It was a recovery mission for something they'd been looking for. I spent the next hour documenting every bone, every symbol, every detail of the impossible graveyard. The suit's cameras recorded everything while I tried to process what I was seeing. Somewhere above me, 7 miles of black water separated me from the surface world where things like this didn't exist. But they did exist. I was standing in the middle of proof that everything we thought we knew about deep ocean life was wrong. That's when my main tether cable snapped. The metallic ping rang through my suit like a gunshot, followed immediately by the sickening sensation of my primary connection to the surface going slack. My communication system automatically switched to the backup frequency, the audio quality noticeably degraded but still functional. But I heard it clearly, along with something else, a low rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once. My entire suit vibrated like someone had struck a massive bell somewhere deep beneath the ocean floor. The vibration ran through the titanium hull and into my bones, a frequency so low it made my teeth ache. Topside. I'm getting some kind of seismic activity down here. Major vibrations coming from below the trench floor. Woods' voice crackled through the static. No seismic readings on our instruments. Probably just your suit adjusting to the pressure differential. Pressure differential, my ass. I'd been at depth for over an hour now, and my suit had been stable the entire time. This was something else entirely. I bent down to retrieve the bone sample and noticed my sonar display flickering back to life. The screen that had been showing nothing but static interference for the past hour suddenly cleared, revealing a contact that made my blood freeze. 300 feet long, rising from what looked like an even deeper section of the trench, climbing toward my position at a steady rate. Topside. My sonar just came back online. I've got a massive contact moving toward me from below. 300 feet in length, ascending rapidly. Calhoun's voice joined the conversation. That's impossible, Leroy. You're at the bottom of the trench. There's nothing below you but rock. I stared at the display. The contact was definitely there, definitely moving, and definitely getting closer. I'm telling you what I'm seeing. Massive sonar return, range decreasing. Whatever it is, it's coming up fast. Kim's voice cut through the static with new urgency. Describe exactly what your instruments are showing. Size, speed, direction of movement. Contact measures approximately 300 feet stem to stern. Currently at 8.4 miles depth, ascending at roughly 50 feet per minute. Range to my position now under 1 mile, and closing. The rumbling beneath me intensified, and I felt it through my boots as much as through the suit's hull. Whatever was down there was big enough to shake the ocean floor. That's when I noticed the bones moving. At first I thought it was current, maybe some kind of underwater landslide triggered by whatever was causing the vibrations. But there was no current at this depth, and the movement was too organized to be random. The skull fragments around my feet appeared to roll across the mud like they were being pulled by invisible strings. Larger bone pieces seemed to shift position, rotating to face different directions. The scattered remains that had been lying in chaotic piles began arranging themselves into more organized patterns. Topside, the skeletal remains are moving, bones shifting position without any apparent current or external force. Wood's response came immediately. Negative. You're experiencing equipment-induced vertigo. The sonar interference is affecting your inner ear balance. Equipment-induced vertigo. Right. Because that explained why I could watch individual bones rolling across the mud in front of my lights, I moved closer to examine one of the large skulls I'd been documenting. The massive cranium had been facing inward toward the center of the depression when I first found it. Now it was turned directly toward me, those empty eye sockets seeming to track my movement. The large skulls have changed orientation. They're all facing my position now. Kim's voice carried a new tension. Document everything you're observing. Provide detailed descriptions of all movement patterns. Document everything, while pretending it wasn't happening. Sure, that made perfect sense. My sonar contact was now less than half a mile below me and still rising. The vibrations through the ocean floor had become so intense that sediment was falling from the walls of the depression, creating small clouds of silt that drifted through my lights. That's when my main tether cable snapped. The metallic ping rang through my suit like a gunshot. followed immediately by the sickening sensation of my primary connection to the surface going slack. I looked up to see the severed cable drifting away into the darkness above. "Topside, my main tether just failed. Repeat, primary cable is severed." Wood's voice crackled through increased static, but remained calm and professional. "Roger that. Your backup emergency line is secure. We're preparing a secondary retrieval cable now. Continue your mission while we set up the backup system." Continue my mission. Right. While sitting 7 miles underwater with only one cable connecting me to the surface, watching impossible things happen all around me. The bone movement was accelerating now. Complete skeletons were shifting position, their articulated remains somehow maintaining their connections as they rearranged themselves across the depression floor. The 15-foot skeleton closest to me began to rise. I watched in absolute terror as the massive humanoid frame lifted itself from the mud. No muscles, no connective tissue, just ancient bones moving in perfect coordination, like they were still alive. The skull turned toward me as the skeleton achieved a standing position, its elongated jaw opening and closing silently. Topside, the skeletal remains are reanimating. Complete skeletons are moving independently, maintaining articulation. Kim's voice became urgent, demanding. "Describe the movement patterns in detail. How are the bones maintaining their positions? What's causing the animation?" How the hell was I supposed to know what was causing it? I was just the guy they'd sent down here to collect samples, not some expert on impossible underwater phenomena. The sonar contact was now less than a quarter mile below me. Whatever was down there was massive enough to create the vibrations that were apparently bringing these ancient skeletons back to life. More bones rose around me. Smaller skeletons, human-sized remains, juvenile versions of the giants. All of them moving with the same impossible coordination, all of them turning to face my position like I was the guest of honor at some underwater resurrection party. Multiple skeletons now mobile, range from juvenile to adult specimens, all oriented toward my position. Wood's voice crackled through increasing interference, the backup communication system struggling with the depth and distance. "Maintain your position and continue documentation. We need complete records of everything you're observing." Maintain my position while surrounded by moving skeletons and whatever 300-foot monster was rising from the depths below me. Sure, no problem. Just another day at the office. The largest skeleton, the 15-footer that had been the first to stand, began moving toward me with deliberate steps. Each footfall sent vibrations through the depression floor that I could feel through my suit. Behind it, the others followed in some kind of procession. Their movements synchronized like a choreographed dance. My backup tether cable started vibrating with increasing intensity, jerking and twisting like something was pulling on it from below. The emergency line that was supposed to be my lifeline to the surface was acting like a fishing line with something big on the hook. Backup cable showing unusual stress patterns. Something's affecting the line tension. Calhoun's voice joined the conversation, nervous and rapid. "That's normal for extreme depth operations. The cable weight creates oscillation patterns that can feel like external force. Normal." Everything was normal, according to the surface team. The moving skeletons, the massive sonar contact, the vibrating cables, all perfectly normal for a routine geological survey. The sonar contact was now less than 1,000 feet below me and still rising. At this rate, whatever it was would reach my depth within minutes. Kim's voice cut through my growing panic. "Leroy, we need you to remain calm and continue documenting. This discovery is unprecedented. Your observations are crucial for understanding what we're dealing with." What we're dealing with? Like they had some idea what was happening down here. Like this wasn't the first time they'd sent someone down to encounter whatever was rising from the deepest parts of the trench. The walking skeleton reached the edge of my lights and stopped, its massive skull tilting as if examining me. The empty eye sockets seemed to focus on my position with what looked like intelligence. Behind it, the other reanimated remains formed a loose circle around the depression, all facing inward toward me. I was trapped 7 miles underwater, surrounded by moving skeletons, with something the size of a city block rising from the depths below. And the people on the surface who were supposed to be keeping me safe were more interested in documentation than extraction. The backup cable jerked harder, nearly pulling me off balance. Whatever was affecting the line was getting stronger as the sonar contact approached. Surface team, I'm requesting immediate emergency ascent. The situation down here is beyond normal parameters. Wood's response was immediate and firm. Negative. Maintain position until we can establish secondary retrieval systems. Your safety is our priority, but we need complete documentation of this discovery. My safety was their priority. Right. That's why they were keeping me down here while ancient skeletons danced around me and something massive approached from the deepest parts of the ocean. The largest skeleton raised one arm and pointed directly at me, its elongated finger bones extending toward my suit. The gesture seemed unmistakably deliberate, appeared unmistakably intelligent. And that's when I realized the surface team had known exactly what I was going to find down here. The creature rose through the darkness, like something from humanity's oldest nightmares, its bioluminescent patterns pulsing in waves across skin that looked like it had never seen sunlight. Multiple tentacles, each longer than a city bus, undulated through the water with deliberate grace. But it was the eyes that made my blood freeze, dozens of them, each the size of a car tire, all focused directly on me with unmistakable intelligence. Jesus Christ, I whispered into my helmet mic. Wood's voice crackled through the static, still maintaining that professional calm that was starting to piss me off. Describe what you're observing, Leroy. Provide detailed measurements and behavioral patterns. Detailed measurements. Right. Like I was going to pull out a tape measure while staring at something that belonged in a deep-sea horror movie. Contact is approximately 150 feet in visible length. Multiple appendages, extensive bioluminescent display, numerous optical organs focused on my position. Note, this appears to be only the head section emerging from deeper trench area. The creature's light patterns shifted from blue to green to colors I didn't have names for, creating a display that seemed to communicate something. Around me, the floating skeletons responded immediately, their movements becoming more coordinated, more purposeful. The 15-foot skeleton that had been circling me rose to eye level, its massive skull positioning itself directly in front of my faceplate. Those empty eye sockets seemed to stare into my soul, while the elongated jaw opened and closed in a rhythm that matched the creature's light display. The skeletal remains are responding to the entity's presence. Coordinated movement patterns suggest some form of communication or control. Kim's voice cut through the interference with new urgency. Document the interaction patterns. How are the remains responding to the creature's signals? How were they responding? Like they were taking orders from something that had been dead for centuries but was apparently running the show down here. The other skeletons formed a perfect circle around me, maintaining equal spacing while they floated at different depths. It was military precision from things that shouldn't be able to move at all. The creature drifted closer, its massive bulk creating currents that pushed against my suit. One tentacle, easily 40 feet long, extended toward me with deliberate slowness. The appendage was covered in the same bioluminescent patterns as the main body, creating a hypnotic display that made it hard to look away. Primary appendage approaching my position, bioluminescent activity increasing. Woods's voice carried new tension. Maintain your position and continue documentation. Do not interfere with the entity's behavior. Do not interfere. Like I had any choice in the matter while surrounded by floating skeletons and being examined by something the size of a subway train. The tentacle stopped just inches from my faceplate, its surface pulsing with light patterns that seemed almost like writing. Close up, I could see the skin wasn't smooth. It was covered in what looked like scales or plates that shifted position as the lights moved across them. My growing suspicions crystallized into certainty. The surface team had known exactly what I was going to find down here. "You knew," I said into my mic. "You knew this thing was down here." Kim's response came immediately. "Focus on documentation, Leroy. Personal speculation isn't helpful right now." Personal speculation. Right. Because it was speculation to notice that they'd sent me down with experimental equipment to coordinates they'd refused to explain, using a payment rate that was 10 times normal, surrounded by enough secrecy to choke a horse. The creature's tentacle began moving around my suit, not touching but examining every surface with obvious intelligence. Other appendages spread out in different directions, creating a web pattern that effectively trapped me in the center of the depression. The largest skeleton opened its jaw and began making clicking sounds that carried through the water into my suit's audio systems. The clicks came in patterns, short, long, short, short, like some kind of code. Skeletal remains producing audible signals. Clicking patterns appear organized, possibly communicative. Calhoun's voice joined the conversation, nervous and rapid. "That's probably just gas escaping from bone cavities under pressure. Normal decomposition effects at extreme depth." Normal decomposition effects. Sure, because that explained why the clicking patterns matched the creature's light display perfectly. My backup tether cable started jerking harder, pulling downward with enough force to drag my suit toward the bottom of the depression. Whatever was affecting the line was getting stronger as more tentacles moved into position around me. Backup cable showing severe stress. Something's pulling the line from below. Woods's voice remained maddeningly calm. "That's normal cable oscillation at extreme depth. Your safety line is secure." I looked down and saw another tentacle wrapped around my emergency cable, deliberately pulling it taut. The creature wasn't just examining me, it was testing my equipment, learning how I was connected to the surface. "Surface team, my backup line is being manipulated by the entity. Repeat, something is actively interfering with my emergency cable." Kim's voice cut through my growing panic. "Leroy, we need you to remain calm and continue your observations. This contact is unprecedented. Your documentation could change everything we know about deep ocean life." Change everything we know. Like they didn't already know exactly what was down here and had sent me down as some kind of test subject. The creature's main body drifted closer, its dozens of eyes studying me from different angles. Each eye seemed to focus independently, creating the disturbing sensation of being examined by multiple intelligences at once. More tentacles emerged from the darkness beyond my lights, smaller appendages that moved with the same deliberate purpose as the larger ones. The creature was massive, much larger than my initial estimate. What I'd thought was the whole body was just the head. Entity is significantly larger than initial assessment. Multiple additional appendages visible beyond the head section. Estimated total length exceeds 300 feet. Initial visual contact was only partial emergence from deeper trench. The clicking sounds from the skulls intensified, creating a chorus that made my teeth ache. The sound seemed to be coming from all directions now, as if the entire collection of bones was participating in some kind of underwater conversation. That's when my backup tether cable snapped under the creature's manipulation. The sharp crack echoed through my suit as my final physical connection to the surface went slack. I watched the severed cable drift away into the darkness, leaving me completely isolated 7 miles underwater with a creature that could crush my suit without effort. Surface team, backup cable has failed. Repeat. Emergency line is severed. Wood's voice crackled through increasing static. Roger that. Initiating emergency retrieval protocols. Maintain position while we deploy secondary recovery systems. Maintain position. Right. While sitting in the middle of an underwater graveyard with a 300-foot monster examining me like a lab specimen, the creature's tentacles began moving in coordinated patterns, creating a cage-like structure around my position. The floating skeletons adjusted their formation to match, maintaining their circle while the massive entity established control over the entire area. The full scope of their deception hit me. Not only had they known about the creature, but they had no intention of pulling me up until they got whatever information they were looking for. They'd sent me down here knowing exactly what I'd find, and they were perfectly willing to let me die if it meant documenting their underwater monster. The largest skull drifted closer to my faceplate, its jaw opening wider than should have been possible. Inside the mouth cavity, I could see what looked like symbols carved into the bone, the same geometric patterns I'd found on the other skulls, but more elaborate. Large skull specimen showing extensive internal markings, carved symbols visible inside jaw cavity. Kim's voice carried new excitement. Document those symbols in detail. Photograph everything you can see. I activated my suit's camera system and focused on the skull's interior. The markings covered every surface inside the mouth, creating patterns that definitely looked like some kind of writing system. Ancient writing that belonged to things that shouldn't exist. The creature's bioluminescent display suddenly intensified, creating light patterns that hurt to look at directly. The skulls responded immediately, their clicking sounds becoming more rapid and organized. And that's when I understood what was happening. This wasn't first contact with some unknown species. This was a reunion. The creature was communicating with the remains of its own kind, and I was witnessing some kind of underwater seance that had been going on for centuries. The surface team hadn't sent me down here to discover something new. They'd sent me down to document something they'd known about for years, maybe decades, something they'd been studying and hiding from the rest of the world. I reached for my suit's emergency ascent controls and activated the independent rise system. The hell with their documentation and their secondary recovery systems. I was getting out of here before whatever was happening down here got worse. Surface team, I'm initiating emergency ascent. Situation has exceeded safe parameters. Wood's voice exploded through the static. Negative. Abort ascent immediately. We need complete documentation before extraction. Complete documentation. They wanted me to stay down here and document my own death, while their underwater monster decided what to do with me. I cut my emergency line with the suit's built-in shears and fired up the ascent thrusters. The suit began rising through the water, but the creature's tentacles moved to intercept my path. The floating skeletons followed my upward movement, like a macabre escort, their clicking sounds now constant and urgent. Below me, the creature's light display created patterns that seemed to pulse with anger or frustration. My suit's pressure warnings activated as I rose too rapidly, but I maintained the emergency ascent rate. Better to risk decompression sickness than whatever the creature had planned for me. Leroy, you are ordered to return to the bottom immediately. Woods' voice carried real panic now. Your ascent rate is dangerous. You'll get decompression sickness. Decompression sickness I could survive. Whatever was happening 7 miles down, I wasn't so sure about. The largest skull kept pace with my rising suit, its jaw opening and closing rapidly while producing clicking sounds that seemed almost frantic. The other skeletons maintained their formation around me, creating an honor guard of ancient bones that followed me toward the surface. Behind them, the creature's tentacles reached upward, stretching toward my position with obvious intent. The massive entity was following my ascent, its bioluminescent patterns now pulsing in what looked like pursuit mode. I pushed my ascent rate beyond the suit's recommended limits, accepting the risk of equipment failure over capture by something that shouldn't exist. 7 miles of black water stretched above me, and somewhere up there was a surface world where things like this were supposed to be impossible. But they weren't impossible. They were real. They were down here, and the government had been hiding them for God knows how long. The clicking sounds from the skulls grew more distant as I rose, but the creature's massive form continued its pursuit. Whatever I'd stumbled into down there, it was bigger than one diver's documentation mission. It was bigger than anything I'd ever imagined. That's when my backup tether cable snapped. The metallic ping rang through my suit like a gunshot, followed immediately by the sickening sensation of my secondary connection to the surface going slack. My communication system struggled to maintain the already degraded backup frequency, the audio quality becoming even more distorted. The massive creature below stretched its tentacles upward like some underwater tree, reaching for sunlight it would never see. One appendage came close enough that I could make out individual scales along its surface, each one the size of a dinner plate and covered in those same bioluminescent patterns. The tentacles stopped maybe 10 feet from my suit, close enough that I could see it pulse with rapid, agitated patterns before falling back into the darkness. "Surface team, I'm at 5 miles and climbing," I reported through the static. Skeletal remains maintaining pursuit formation. Woods' voice came through so distorted I could barely make out the words. "Eroy. Can. Hear. Systems." The skulls around me had started making a different sound. Not the organized clicking from before, but a low-frequency buzz that seemed to vibrate through the water itself. My suit's communication array began fritzing, displays flickering between normal readings and complete garbage. At 4 miles depth, my ascent slowed as something massive moved into my path from above. A second creature descended toward me, smaller than the monster below, but still easily 100 feet long. Multiple eyes tracked my movement while tentacles spread out to block my route to the surface. This one looked younger somehow, its movements more aggressive, less calculated than the ancient thing rising from the trench floor. I had to choose between going around its bulk or trying to push through the gap between its tentacles. Either option would slow my ascent and give the creature below time to catch up. My emergency ascent system started throwing warning lights across my display. The rapid pressure changes were pushing the equipment beyond its design limits. The automated safety protocols tried to slow my rise rate, but I overrode them with manual controls, pushing the system even harder. Better to risk explosive decompression than whatever these things had planned for me. The descending creature positioned itself directly overhead, tentacles spreading wide to create a living net. Behind me, the skulls maintained their formation, while that constant buzzing grew louder, making my teeth ache even through the suit's insulation. That's when they started hitting me. The first impact rang through my helmet like someone had struck it with a hammer. I looked around to see the largest skull drawing back for another attack, its elongated jaw stretched wide enough to engulf my entire helmet. More impacts followed as the other skulls joined the assault. Each hit sent vibrations through my suit's hull and left scratches across my faceplate. The scratches formed patterns, not random damage, but deliberate markings that looked almost like the symbols I'd seen carved into their bones. My hull integrity warnings activated as the repeated impacts stressed the titanium beyond normal parameters. These things were trying to crack my suit open 7 miles underwater. I reached for my emergency systems and activated the flare deployment. Brilliant white light exploded around my position, brighter than anything these depths had seen in millions of years. The skulls recoiled immediately, their formation breaking as they tried to escape the sudden illumination. For a few seconds, I had clear water above me and pushed my ascent rate even higher. The second creature above me writhed away from the flares, its tentacles contracting as it tried to shield its multiple eyes from the light. I shot through the gap it left, my suit's thrusters working overtime to maintain the emergency climb. But at 3 miles depth, both creatures began moving toward my position simultaneously. The massive entity from below had gained ground during my encounter with the skulls, its tentacles now reaching upward in coordinated sweeps. The smaller creature above had recovered from the flare burst and was descending again, positioning itself to intercept my rise. They were working together, creating a pincer movement designed to trap me between them. My navigation system started displaying impossible readings as that low-frequency buzzing intensified. The depth gauge showed I was simultaneously at 3 miles, 7 miles, and somehow negative depth all at the same time. My compass spun wildly before settling on magnetic north, being directly below me. The tentacles from both creatures began weaving together, creating a living web that stretched across my entire field of vision. Each appendage moved deliberately, filling gaps in the pattern until there was no clear path to the surface. My hull integrity warnings turned red as the water pressure around me fluctuated wildly. The creature's movements were creating pressure waves that stressed my suit beyond anything it was designed to handle. Joints that should have been solid started flexing, and I could hear the titanium hull creaking under the strain. The buzzing from the skulls reached a crescendo that made my vision blur. Through the chaos of sound and flashing warning lights, I could barely make out Woods' voice trying to reach me through the communication breakdown. Emergency, protocols, immediate, extraction. Too little, too late. Whatever extraction protocols they had wouldn't work with 2 massive creatures actively preventing my ascent and a formation of reanimated skeletons trying to crack my suit open. I pushed my emergency systems past every safety limit, maxing out the ascent rate and accepting the certainty of equipment failure over the alternative of staying trapped between these impossible things. The creature's tentacles tightened their web pattern, leaving gaps barely wide enough for my suit to pass through, but gaps nonetheless. I aimed for the largest opening and pushed my thrusters beyond maximum power, shooting toward the surface through a tunnel of living flesh that pulsed with rapid, intense bioluminescent patterns on all sides. I broke through the web of tentacles at 2 miles depth, my suit's thrusters screaming at maximum power as I shot toward the surface. The creature's bioluminescent patterns flashed angry red behind me, but I was past their reach now, climbing through water that felt different, lighter somehow, less oppressive than the crushing darkness below. The skeletal remains weren't giving up. Even as the water pressure decreased around me, they maintained their pursuit formation, their clicking sounds now constant and urgent. My suit registered impact after impact as the floating skulls continued their coordinated attacks, each hit sending vibrations through my helmet that made my vision blur. The largest skull kept pace with my ascent, its elongated jaw snapping at my faceplate with mechanical precision. Each strike left new scratches across my helmet, and I could see hairline cracks starting to form in the titanium-reinforced glass. My depth gauge read 2 miles and climbing when Woods' voice suddenly came through my speakers, crystal clear for the first time since I'd hit bottom. "Leroy, respond immediately. We're tracking massive sonar contacts moving toward the surface." The relief of hearing a clear transmission almost made me laugh. "Woods, I'm at 2 miles depth and climbing fast. Multiple hostile contacts in pursuit. The skeletal remains are still active and attacking my suit." "Roger that. We're seeing them on our instruments now." Jesus Christ, what the hell is down there? So they could see the creatures on their sonar after all. Funny how their equipment started working properly once I was being chased by impossible monsters. "Prepare emergency retrieval protocols. Woods continued, his voice tighter than before. "We're lowering additional cables to assist your ascent." Additional cables. Right. Because now that their underwater nightmare was heading for the surface, suddenly they were concerned about my safety. The attacking skulls maintained their assault as I climbed, but their movements were becoming less coordinated. Whatever force had been animating them seemed to weaken as the water pressure decreased. The largest skull made one final lunge at my helmet before its jaw went slack and it began drifting downward, returning to the lifeless bone it should have been all along. One by one, the other skulls lost their animation and began falling back toward the trench floor. Their clicking sounds faded into silence as they tumbled through the darkness, leaving me alone with just the massive creatures rising from below. At 1 mile depth, I could see the research vessel's lights above me, brilliant white spots that looked like stars after hours in the absolute darkness of the deep ocean. The sight gave me a surge of hope that maybe, just maybe, I was going to survive this nightmare. But the largest creature wasn't giving up. Its massive bulk continued rising through the water below me, tentacles stretched upward in pursuit. Through my suit's rear cameras, I could see dark shapes moving through the water, each one the size of a subway car, and gaining ground despite my emergency ascent rate. My remaining backup tether cable jerked and twisted as something massive brushed against it far below. Woods' voice crackled through the speakers again. "Leroy, we're reading massive displacement below your position. How big is this thing?" "Bigger than anything that should exist," I replied, pushing my thrusters beyond their safety limits. 300 feet minimum, maybe larger, multiple appendages, definitely intelligent behavior. Calhoun's nervous voice joined the conversation. "That's impossible. Nothing that large could survive at those depths. Tell that to the thing chasing me." My suit's pressure warnings had turned from yellow to red as I maintained the dangerous ascent rate, but I ignored them. Better to risk explosive decompression than let whatever was below me reach the surface while I was still in the water. At 500 feet, I could make out individual crew members moving around the research vessel's deck. Emergency lights had been activated, and I could see them preparing retrieval equipment, cables, winches, what looked like the entire ship's complement of safety gear. That's when the creature's topmost tentacles broke the surface. The water around the ship erupted as massive appendages emerged from the depths, each one easily 40 feet long and covered in those same bioluminescent patterns I'd seen below. The tentacles rose high enough to tower over the research vessel's superstructure before crashing back down, creating waves that rocked the ship violently from side to side. Crew members scrambled across the deck, some running for safety equipment while others tried to maintain their footing as the ship pitched in the creature's wake. Emergency alarms started blaring and I could see Kim shouting orders that I couldn't hear over the chaos. My suit broke the surface just as another tentacle emerged near the ship's hull, close enough that I could see individual scales along its surface. Each scale was the size of a dinner plate and pulsed with rapid light patterns that hurt to look at directly. "Surface! Surface!" I shouted into my mic, though anyone with eyes could see I'd made it up. Woods and 2 other crew members immediately secured retrieval lines to my suit's emergency attachment points. The ship's mechanical winch system engaged with a grinding roar, hauling me toward the deck as fast as the equipment could manage. As they pulled me from the water, I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood freeze. Just below the surface, easily 50 feet across, a massive eye watched the retrieval operation with unmistakable intelligence. The pupil alone was larger than my entire suit, and it tracked my movement with the kind of focus that suggested I was being memorized for future reference. The eye held my gaze for maybe 3 seconds before the creature submerged again, its tentacles following it back into the depths. The water around the ship gradually calmed, but I could still see bioluminescent flashes deep below the surface, The thing was still down there, still watching. My suit touched the deck with a metallic clang that felt like the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. Solid surface, breathable atmosphere, just a helmet removal away, and most importantly, no more creatures trying to crack me open like a lobster. Woods and his team immediately began disconnecting my suit systems, while Kim approached with something in her hand. I was still trying to process what I'd just survived when I felt a sharp pinch in my neck, right where the suit's collar met my skin. "What the hell?" I started to say, but the words came out slurred. Kim stepped back, holding an empty syringe. "Just something to help with the decompression trauma, Leroy. You've been through a lot." The deck started spinning around me, and my vision began tunneling toward darkness. Whatever she'd injected me with was working fast, turning my thoughts to cotton and my limbs to lead. "The creatures," I mumbled, fighting to stay conscious. You knew they were down there." "Rest now," Kim said, her voice sounding like it was coming from the end of a very long tunnel. "Everything's going to be fine." The last thing I saw before the drug took hold was Woods and Calhoun exchanging a look that confirmed what I'd suspected all along. They'd known exactly what I was going to find down there, and now they were making sure I wouldn't remember it clearly enough to tell anyone else. I opened my eyes to white ceiling tiles and the antiseptic smell that screams hospital from a mile away. My head felt like someone had filled it with cotton balls and shaken it hard. And when I tried to sit up, the room spun just enough to make me think twice about moving too fast. "Good. You're awake." Agent Kim's voice came from somewhere to my right. I turned to see her sitting in one of those uncomfortable plastic chairs hospitals love, holding a clipboard like she was taking inventory of my consciousness. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck." My throat felt raw, scratchy. "What happened? How long have I been here?" Kim adjusted her glasses and consulted whatever was on that clipboard. 3 days. You suffered severe decompression sickness during your emergency ascent, along with oxygen deprivation that caused some temporary psychological symptoms. 3 days. I tried to remember anything after hitting the surface, but everything after Kim's injection was fragmented and hazy. "The creatures..." "Hallucinations," she said quickly. "Nitrogen narcosis combined with extreme depth psychosis. It's more common than you'd think with rapid ascent procedures." The door opened and a man in a white coat walked in, carrying a tablet and wearing the kind of smile doctors practice in medical school. Tall guy, red hair going thin on top, tired eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He looked like he'd been working too many late shifts. "Mr. Vasquez, I'm Dr. Levi McGuire. I specialize in deep-sea diving trauma." He pulled up another plastic chair and sat down like we were old friends. "I've been monitoring your recovery since you were brought in." "Recovery from what exactly?" Dr. McGuire glanced at Kim before answering. "You experienced what we call acute stress reaction, triggered by multiple equipment failures during your dive. Your suit's life support systems began experiencing cascading failures at approximately 4 miles depth, with complete system breakdown occurring much deeper, forcing an emergency ascent that put tremendous strain on your nervous system." 4 miles, not 7.2. Not the impossible depths where I'd found those skeletons and watched ancient bones dance through the water. They were claiming the failures started at 4 miles, conveniently ignoring everything that happened after. That's not what happened. "I understand your memories feel very real," Dr. McGuire said, his voice taking on that patient tone doctors use when they think you're losing it. "But the human brain creates extremely vivid false memories when subjected to nitrogen narcosis and oxygen deprivation. What you experienced down there was your mind trying to process the trauma of equipment failure and life-threatening danger." Kim slid a folder across the bedside table. Your medical records. Everything's documented. The decompression injuries, the psychological symptoms, the treatment protocols we've used to stabilize your condition. I opened the folder and found pages of medical charts, test results, and doctor's notes that painted a picture of someone who'd barely survived a catastrophic diving accident. Blood oxygen levels, brain scans, psychological evaluations, all of it pointing to equipment failure and resulting trauma. But I remembered those creatures. The massive eye watching me from below the surface, tentacles thick as tree trunks reaching up from depths that shouldn't exist. The clicking sounds from floating skulls, the bioluminescent patterns that hurt to look at directly. The skeletal remains, I said. I documented everything with the suit's cameras. Dr. McGuire shook his head. Your suit's recording systems failed along with the life support. We have no recoverable visual documentation of your dive below 3 miles depth due to the equipment failures. No documentation. How convenient. What about Woods and Calhoun? They were monitoring everything from the surface. Kim's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. Both men have been reassigned to other projects. They're not available for consultation. Reassigned. Just like that, the two people who could verify what really happened had vanished into the government machine. I want to talk to them. I'm afraid that's not possible, Kim said. Their current assignments are classified. Dr. McGuire leaned forward, his hands clasped like he was about to deliver bad news. Leroy, I need you to understand something. Your insistence that these hallucinations were real experiences is a common symptom of diving-related psychological trauma, the brain's way of protecting itself from accepting the reality of how close you came to dying. I stared at him. You're telling me that everything I saw down there was just my imagination? I'm telling you that your brain created those images to help process an extremely traumatic experience. Nitrogen narcosis can produce hallucinations so vivid they feel more real than actual memories. Kim pulled out another set of papers. We've made some adjustments to your contract to account for the medical trauma you've experienced. Additional compensation for the psychological impact and extended recovery time. The paper showed a payment increase that brought my total to $300,000. Enough money to solve every financial problem I had, with plenty left over. All I had to do was agree that my memories of impossible creatures were just hallucinations brought on by equipment failure. This also includes your agreement that all mission details remain classified under national security regulations, Kim continued. Standard protocol for any government diving contract, but especially important given the experimental nature of the equipment you were testing. Testing. Right. Because sending a civilian diver to depths no human had ever survived was just routine equipment testing. Dr. McGuire reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a prescription bottle. I'm prescribing medication for anxiety and post-traumatic stress. These will help manage the psychological symptoms while your brain processes what happened during the dive. I took the bottle and read the label. Antipsychotics, mixed with something I'd never heard of. What exactly are these supposed to do? Help stabilize your mood and reduce the intensity of traumatic memories. Many divers who've experienced similar incidents find them very helpful for returning to normal life. Similar incidents. How many other divers had they sent down to encounter whatever was living in those trenches? How many had come back with stories about impossible creatures, only to be drugged and told their memories were hallucinations? Your diving certification will need to be suspended until you receive psychological clearance from our medical board, Kim added. Standard procedure after any incident involving decompression sickness and psychological trauma. No more diving. No more income from the one skill that had kept me afloat financially for 23 years. but $300,000 would buy me time to figure out what came next. I looked at the contract amendment, then at the prescription bottle, then at the two people who were systematically dismantling everything I thought I knew about what had happened 7 miles underwater. "The payment increase," I said. "Why so much extra money for a routine equipment failure?" Kim's expression remained neutral. "The government takes contractor safety very seriously. When our experimental equipment causes injury, we ensure full compensation for medical expenses and lost income. Full compensation for keeping my mouth shut about whatever I'd really found down there. The money was hush money, pure and simple." Dr. McGuire stood up and adjusted his glasses. "I'll be setting up follow-up appointments to monitor your recovery. It's important that you take the medication as prescribed and attend all scheduled sessions. Diving-related psychological trauma can have long-term effects if not properly treated." After he left, Kim gathered her papers and prepared to go. "A car will pick you up tomorrow morning to take you to the airport. Your flight back to Miami is already booked." Just like that? 3 days in the hospital and then back to normal life? You've been through a traumatic experience, but you're physically healthy. The psychological symptoms will fade with proper treatment and time. She paused at the door. "Leroy, I want you to understand something. The work we do with the Department of Oceanic Research is vital to national security. Sometimes that work involves risks, and sometimes those risks result in accidents like yours. But the information gathered from these missions helps protect American interests in ways the public never needs to know about. National security. The magic words that justified everything from secret budgets to cover-ups of impossible creatures living in the deepest parts of the ocean." After she left, I sat in the hospital bed staring at the contract amendment and the prescription bottle. $300,000 for agreeing that my memories were hallucinations. Medication to help me forget what I'd seen. A suspended diving certification to make sure I never got close to the truth again. But I remembered those creatures. I remembered the intelligence in that massive eye, the deliberate movements of tentacles that belonged to something older and larger than anything science admitted existed. I remembered floating skeletons that clicked in patterns too organized to be random, and bioluminescent displays that looked like writing in languages humanity had never learned. They could drug me, pay me, and threaten me with prosecution under the Espionage Act. But they couldn't make me forget what I'd seen 7 miles down in the deepest parts of the Pacific. The question was whether I was willing to risk everything: the money, my freedom, maybe even my life, to prove that the impossible things living in those trenches were real. I signed the contract amendment and pocketed the prescription bottle, but I didn't plan on taking the pills. The government sedan pulled up to LAX's departure terminal exactly on schedule, because of course it did. Kim had spent the entire drive from the hospital explaining how my diving career was officially over, thanks to the psychological evaluation results that painted me as mentally unstable. Apparently, seeing impossible creatures 7 miles underwater was grounds for permanent certification suspension. "The Espionage Act carries serious penalties," she said, as we sat in the passenger pickup zone. "Prison time, financial ruin, complete loss of security clearance for any future government work. I want to make sure you understand what's at stake if you decide to discuss mission details with anyone." I adjusted the strap of my duffel bag, the only possession they'd let me keep from the hospital. "And if I keep quiet? You keep your $300,000 and live a comfortable life. Maybe start a diving instruction business, teach tourists in shallow water. There are worse ways to spend your retirement." Retirement. At 45, with 23 years of commercial diving experience that I apparently couldn't use anymore, but 300 grand would buy me time to figure out what came next. A man approached our car from the terminal entrance. Tall, athletic build, dark hair cut conservatively short. He wore a Navy suit that screamed federal agent and carried himself like someone used to being obeyed. "Leroy, I'd like you to meet Agent Alexander Rodriguez," Kim said as the man opened my door. "He'll be your contact for ongoing psychological monitoring." Rodriguez extended his hand with a professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Vasquez, I'll be conducting regular welfare checks to ensure you're adjusting properly to civilian life after your experience." I shook his hand, noting the grip that lasted just a second too long. "Welfare checks? Standard protocol for contractors who've experienced diving-related psychological trauma," he explained. "The government takes mental health seriously. We want to make sure you have all the support you need during your recovery." Support? Right. Like surveillance disguised as concern for my well-being. Kim handed Rodriguez a thick folder. "Complete medical records and psychological evaluation results. Dr. McGuire's recommendations for ongoing treatment are in the final section." "Excellent." Rodriguez tucked the folder under his arm. "Leroy, your first appointment is scheduled for next Friday at 2 p.m. I'll call with the location details." The skeletal remains weren't giving up. Even as the water pressure decreased around me, I could hear their clicking sounds through my suit's hull. The pattern now, all I had to do was take my pills, keep my mouth shut, and pretend that 7 miles underwater was just a bad dream. The boarding announcement for my Miami flight echoed through the terminal. Kim gave me a final look that managed to be both sympathetic and threatening. "Take care of yourself, Leroy. And remember, your new life starts now." I grabbed my bag and headed into the airport, leaving behind the woman who'd orchestrated my descent into an underwater nightmare and the agent who'd be watching me for the rest of my life. The flight to Miami gave me 3 hours to think about everything that had happened, but thinking was harder than it should have been. The medication they'd given me made my thoughts feel sluggish, like trying to run through deep water. Every time I tried to focus on specific details from the dive, the memories seemed to slip away. 2 passengers caught my attention during boarding: a woman in a business suit who kept glancing in my direction, and a man with a camera bag who seemed more interested in photographing me than the view outside. They sat separately, but both had clear sightlines to my seat. The woman took notes throughout the flight, writing in a small notebook every time I got up to use the bathroom or ordered a drink. The man with the camera was more subtle, but I caught him taking pictures with his phone whenever he thought I wasn't looking. Government babysitters, making sure I didn't talk to anyone about my recent diving experience, or maybe documenting my behavior to see if the medication was working properly. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the creature's bioluminescent patterns, but the details felt fuzzy around the edges. The pills were working exactly as intended, making it harder to distinguish between real memories and what Dr. McGuire called trauma-induced hallucinations. By the time we landed in Miami, I was starting to question whether the massive eye I'd seen below the surface had really been the size of a car tire, or if nitrogen narcosis had distorted my perceptions. Maybe the tentacles hadn't been 40 feet long. Maybe the floating skeletons hadn't been clicking in organized patterns. Maybe the government was right, and everything I thought I'd experienced was just my brain's way of processing equipment failure and near-death trauma. The taxi dropped me off at my apartment complex just after sunset. 5 days away felt like 5 months. Everything looked smaller somehow, more ordinary than I remembered. My neighbors, Mrs. Chen from 2B and old Mr. Patterson, who lived downstairs, were waiting by the mailboxes like they'd been expecting me. "Leroy!" Mrs. Chen hurried over, her face creased with worry. "We were so concerned when those federal agents came by. They said you'd been in an accident." Federal agents? Of course they'd been here. What kind of agents? Mr. Patterson joined us, leaning heavily on his walking cane. FBI, they said. Very official, very serious. Asked a lot of questions about your diving equipment, whether you'd been acting strangely before you left. They went through your apartment, Mrs. Chen added quietly. Had a search warrant and everything. Took several boxes of stuff with them. I felt my stomach drop. What kind of stuff? Papers mostly. Some equipment from your closet. They said they were investigating potential safety violations related to your diving gear. Safety violations. Another lie to cover their tracks while they sanitized my apartment of anything that might contradict their official story. I climbed the stairs to my second-floor unit, noting that the lock looked different. New deadbolt, new handle, probably new keys that the government could access whenever they wanted. Inside, the apartment felt wrong. Too clean, too organized, like someone had gone through everything and put it back just slightly off from where it belonged. My diving logs were gone. 23 years of detailed records documenting every job, every depth, every piece of equipment I'd used. The certification papers that proved my qualifications had vanished from the file cabinet. Even my personal diving gear had been removed from the closet. They'd erased my professional history, making it impossible for me to prove my experience or credibility if I ever tried to tell anyone what had really happened during that mission. The phone rang just as I was checking the kitchen cabinets. Everything edible had been replaced with fresh groceries, like someone wanted to make sure I had no reason to leave the apartment for a few days. Leroy, this is Agent Rodriguez. I wanted to make sure you arrived home safely. Yeah, I'm here. Thanks for the concern. Excellent. I've scheduled your first check-in for Friday at 2 p.m. The address is 1247 Biscayne Boulevard, Suite 402. It's a medical facility that specializes in diving-related psychological trauma. Another government front, probably. What exactly happens during these check-ins? Just routine psychological evaluation. We'll discuss how you're adjusting to civilian life, monitor your medication effectiveness, make sure you're getting the support you need. Nothing invasive. Nothing invasive except constant surveillance and regular appointments to make sure their drugs were keeping me compliant. I should mention, Rodriguez continued, your medical insurance has been upgraded to include comprehensive psychiatric coverage through our provider network. No co-pays, no deductibles. The government wants to ensure you receive the best possible care. The best possible care to keep me quiet about what I'd seen. That's very generous. We take care of our contractors, Leroy, especially those who've experienced what you've been through. What I'd been through. Like he knew exactly what had happened 7 miles underwater. Have there been others? Other divers with similar experiences? A pause that lasted just long enough to be noticeable. Diving-related psychological episodes are more common than most people realize. Deep sea work puts tremendous stress on the human mind. We've developed protocols for managing these cases based on extensive experience. Extensive experience with divers who'd encountered impossible creatures and needed to be discredited afterward. How many others had they sent down to those trenches? How many had come back with stories about things that weren't supposed to exist? Your case isn't unique, Rodriguez added. Several other divers have experienced similar psychological breaks during extreme depth missions. 2 are currently receiving long-term psychiatric treatment for persistent delusions about sea monsters. Sea monsters? He said it like the words tasted bitter, like he was repeating something he'd been trained to say but didn't quite believe himself. The important thing is that you're safe now, he continued. You survived a traumatic experience, and with proper treatment, you'll be able to move forward with your life. After he hung up, I sat in my sanitized apartment and tried to piece together what they'd told me. Equipment failure at 4 miles depth, nitrogen narcosis causing vivid hallucinations, emergency ascent resulting in decompression sickness and psychological trauma. but I could still remember the weight of that massive eye watching me from below the surface. The deliberate intelligence behind those tentacle movements. The organized clicking sounds from floating skulls that had moved with purpose too complex for random hallucination. The medication made it harder to focus on those details, but they were still there, buried under chemical fog and government lies, but real. I found a pen and a notepad in the kitchen drawer, one of the few things they hadn't removed, and started writing down everything I could remember about the dive. The coordinates, the equipment specifications, the crew members' names. Every detail I could pull from my increasingly fuzzy memory, but as I tried to recall the specific moments when my equipment failed, the timeline felt muddled by the medication. Had my main tether snapped first, or was it the backup? The sequence of failures that had left me stranded seemed to blur together in my drugged memory. If Rodriguez and his people thought they could drug me into forgetting what I'd seen, they were going to be disappointed. $300,000 bought their silence, but it didn't buy their version of reality. I had work to do. The first week back felt like learning to live inside someone else's life. Every morning I'd wake up expecting to hear the ocean, but instead got Miami traffic and the hum of air conditioning units working overtime against the Florida heat. The medication made everything feel wrapped in cotton, sounds muffled, thoughts moving like they were swimming upstream. Rodriguez called every other day just checking in. How was I sleeping? Any unusual dreams? Was I taking my pills as prescribed? Always the same concerned tone, like he genuinely cared about my well-being instead of making sure I stayed chemically compliant. I started flushing the pills down the toilet after the third day. The fog in my head began clearing, but with it came sharper memories of things I was supposed to forget. The clicking sounds from those floating skulls, the deliberate way that massive tentacle had wrapped around my emergency cable. The intelligence behind that car-sized eye watching me from below the surface. 2 weeks in, I decided to do some research. The Miami Public Library's computer terminals felt like artifacts from another era, but they'd do for what I needed. I started with basic geological surveys of the Pacific, looking for any mention of deep water trench formations at the coordinates I remembered. Nothing. According to every official survey, the ocean floor in that area was relatively shallow, maybe 3 miles at most. No mention of trenches extending beyond 7 miles, no unusual formations, no reason for the government to send experimental diving equipment to investigate geological features that apparently didn't exist. I tried different search terms: deep ocean anomalies, unexplained Pacific formations, military diving operations. Each search returned sanitized results that felt deliberately incomplete, like someone had scrubbed the internet of anything that might support my memories. The librarian, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair, noticed me struggling with the ancient computer system. Finding everything you need. Looking for information about deep ocean trenches, specifically in the Pacific, but the search results seem limited. She adjusted her glasses and leaned closer to the screen. What kind of depth are we talking about? 7 miles or deeper. Her expression shifted slightly. That's Mariana Trench territory, deepest part of the ocean. But if you're looking for recent research, a lot of that information is classified or restricted to academic databases. Classified. Of course it was. Any way to access those academic databases? With a university ID or research credentials. Are you a student? I thought about my suspended diving certification and the $300,000 sitting in my bank account. Not exactly. She glanced around the library, then lowered her voice. There's a marine biology professor at University of Miami who sometimes gives public lectures about deep ocean research. Dr. Sarah Chen. She might be able to point you toward publicly available information. Dr. Chen's office was tucked away in the basement of the university's marine science building, surrounded by aquarium tanks and charts of ocean currents. She was younger than I had expected, maybe mid-30s, with short black hair and the kind of intense focus that came from spending years studying things most people never thought about. "Mr. Vasquez, right? You mentioned on the phone that you're interested in deep Pacific formations." I'd prepared a cover story about writing a book on commercial diving, but something about her direct manner made me want to tell the truth. "I'm a commercial diver. Recently worked a job in the Pacific that involved some unusual geological features." She gestured toward a chair across from her desk. "What kind of features?" "Trench formations extending beyond 7 miles depth. But when I try to research the location, I can't find any official surveys that mention unusual depth in that area." Dr. Chen pulled out a thick atlas and flipped to a Pacific Ocean chart. "Can you show me the approximate coordinates?" I pointed to the area where I remembered the research vessel anchoring. She studied the chart for a long moment, then pulled out a different reference book. "According to standard bathymetric surveys, that region shows typical abyssal plain characteristics, 3 to 4 miles maximum depth." She looked up from the book. "But there's something interesting about this area." She turned to her computer and pulled up what looked like a government database. "This region has been subject to restricted navigation orders on and off for the past 15 years. Military exercises, they claim. But the scheduling is irregular, and the restrictions cover a much larger area than typical naval operations would require." Restricted navigation. That explained why civilian research vessels wouldn't have detailed surveys of the area. "Any idea what kind of military exercises?" "Deep water testing, according to the public notices. But the equipment specifications they list don't match any known naval diving systems." She leaned back in her chair. "Mr. Vasquez, can I ask what kind of diving job you were doing out there?" I weighed my options. Dr. Chen seemed genuinely curious about the scientific aspects, not the kind of person who'd report our conversation to federal agents. "Geological survey work, experimental equipment, very deep water." "How deep?" 7.2 miles. Her eyes widened. "That's impossible. No atmospheric diving suit can handle that kind of pressure. Even the most advanced military systems max out around 4 miles. "That's what I thought too." She turned back to her computer and started typing rapidly. "There have been rumors in the marine biology community about classified deep ocean research. Projects that use technology decades ahead of anything in the public sector." "What kind of rumors?" "Encounters with unknown species at extreme depths. Specimens that don't match any known classification system. But anyone who talks about it publicly tends to lose their research funding very quickly." "Unknown species, like 15-foot humanoid skeletons that moved with deliberate intelligence. Have you ever heard of anyone finding skeletal remains in deep ocean trenches? Large specimens, possibly humanoid characteristics?" Dr. Chen stopped typing and stared at me. "Where exactly did you hear about that?" "Hypothetically speaking." She was quiet for a long moment, then pulled a file folder from her desk drawer. "This is completely off the record, but there have been reports. Deep-sea fishing vessels occasionally bring up bone fragments that don't match any known marine species. The specimens always disappear before they can be properly studied." She showed me photographs of bone fragments that looked disturbingly familiar. Elongated skull pieces, jaw sections with teeth designed for tearing flesh, arm bones that would have belonged to something much larger than human. These photos were taken by a research vessel working near the Mariana Trench 5 years ago. The specimens were confiscated by federal agents before any detailed analysis could be conducted. The bone fragments in the photos matched what I'd seen 7 miles down. Same proportions, same ancient appearance, same impossible size. The fishing crews who bring up these specimens, I said carefully, what happens to them? They're usually paid substantial compensation for their cooperation and asked to sign non-disclosure agreements, standard procedure for protecting sensitive marine research, according to the government. Paid compensation and non-disclosure agreements, just like my own situation, but with fishermen instead of divers. Dr. Chen closed the file folder and slid it back into her drawer. Mr. Vasquez, I don't know what you encountered during your diving job, but I'd be very careful about discussing it publicly. The marine research community has learned that certain topics are better left unexplored. I thanked her for her time and left the university with more questions than answers. But at least I knew I wasn't the only one who'd encountered evidence of impossible things living in the deepest parts of the ocean. That evening, I started writing everything down. I found an old composition notebook in my kitchen drawer, one of the few things the federal agents hadn't confiscated, and began documenting every detail I could remember about the dive, the equipment specifications, the crew members' names, the exact sequence of equipment failures that had supposedly caused my hallucinations. But as I wrote, inconsistencies in their official story became obvious. If my life support systems had failed at 4 miles depth, how had I survived the additional 3 miles of descent? If nitrogen narcosis had caused my hallucinations, why were the details so consistent and organized instead of random and chaotic? I hid the notebook behind my bedroom dresser, taped to the back panel where casual searching wouldn't find it. If Rodriguez and his people decided to conduct another safety inspection of my apartment, I wanted my real memories preserved somewhere they couldn't sanitize. The next morning, I tried calling Tyler Woods. The number I had for him was disconnected. When I called the Navy personnel office and asked about his current assignment, they told me no Tyler Woods had ever served in submarine rescue operations. According to their records, no one by that name had ever been a Master Chief Petty Officer. I tried Skylar Calhoun next. MIT's alumni office had no record of any graduate by that name in their electrical engineering program. The communications specialist who'd monitored my dive from the surface had apparently never existed. They'd erased the crew members from official records, making it impossible for me to contact anyone who could verify what had really happened during the mission. Woods and Calhoun had either been using false identities, or their real identities had been scrubbed from every database I could access. But people don't just vanish completely. Everyone leaves traces, employment records, tax filings, social media accounts. I spent the next week trying different approaches, searching for any mention of the research vessel Neptune or the Department of Oceanic Research. Nothing. No ship registrations, no government department listings, no budget allocations in any public records. The entire operation had been designed to disappear the moment it was over. Rodriguez called that Friday to confirm our appointment. His voice carried the same professional concern, but I thought I detected something else underneath. Maybe satisfaction that his psychological monitoring was proceeding according to plan. "How are you adjusting to civilian life?" he asked during our session. "Any recurring thoughts about your diving experience?" We met in a sterile office building on Biscayne Boulevard, the kind of place that rented space to businesses that preferred not to advertise their activities. Rodriguez sat behind a desk that looked like it had been purchased from a government surplus catalog, taking notes in a folder that already contained several pages of documentation about my behavior. "I'm doing fine," I lied. "The medication is helping with the anxiety." "Excellent. And your sleep patterns? Any unusual dreams or nightmares?" "Nothing out of the ordinary." He made a note in his file. "Have you had any contact with former colleagues from your diving career? Sometimes people in your situation try to seek validation for their experiences by discussing them with others in the field." "Former colleagues." like the ones who'd apparently received visits from federal agents warning them against spreading rumors. No, I've been keeping to myself mostly. That's probably wise. Your psychological evaluation indicates that social isolation during the recovery period can actually be beneficial for processing traumatic memories. Social isolation. Another way of saying they wanted me cut off from anyone who might believe my story or help me investigate what had really happened. Rodriguez opened another folder and slid several photographs across the desk. I wanted to show you something that might help put your experience in perspective. The photos showed two men in what looked like psychiatric hospital settings. Both appeared heavily medicated, their eyes unfocused and vacant. One was maybe 50 years old, the other younger, probably in his 30s. These are former Department of Oceanic Research contractors who experienced similar psychological episodes during deepwater missions, Rodriguez explained. Both insisted that their equipment failure hallucinations were real encounters with unknown sea creatures. He pointed to the older man's photo. David Martinez, commercial diver with 15 years experience, suffered complete psychological breakdown after claiming he encountered giant underwater entities during a routine geological survey. He's been receiving treatment for persistent delusional disorder for 3 years now. The younger man looked familiar somehow, though I couldn't place where I might have seen him before. And this one, James Fletcher, former Navy diver, excellent service record until his mission for our department. Similar claims about sea monsters and reanimated skeletal remains. He's currently in long-term psychiatric care after multiple suicide attempts. Reanimated skeletal remains. Fletcher had seen the same things I had, down to specific details that matched my own memories. But instead of being paid to keep quiet, he'd been institutionalized for refusing to accept the official story. The point is, Rodriguez continued, your experience follows a documented pattern. Deep-water diving at extreme depths can cause psychological breaks that produce remarkably consistent hallucinations. The human brain seems to create similar fantasy scenarios when subjected to life-threatening equipment failures. Consistent hallucinations, or consistent encounters with real creatures that the government couldn't afford to acknowledge publicly. Both men had the opportunity to accept medical treatment and financial compensation for their traumatic experiences, Rodriguez added. Unfortunately, their insistence on the reality of their hallucinations made it necessary to pursue more intensive psychiatric intervention. The threat was clear: accept their version of events and live comfortably on government money, or end up like Martinez and Fletcher, drugged into compliance and locked away from anyone who might listen to their stories. I understand, I said. I'm grateful for the support I've been receiving. Rodriguez smiled and closed the folders. Excellent. I'm pleased to hear you're making such good progress. With continued medication and regular monitoring, there's no reason you can't live a completely normal life. Normal life under constant surveillance, with regular check-ins to ensure I remained chemically compliant. But at least I wasn't in a psychiatric ward like the other divers who'd encountered the creatures. That night, I added Martinez and Fletcher's names to my hidden notebook. 2 more pieces of evidence that the Department of Oceanic Research had been sending divers to encounter impossible creatures for years, then systematically destroying anyone who tried to tell the truth about what they'd found. But why? What was so important about keeping those creatures secret that the government would ruin lives and destroy careers to maintain the cover-up? I started researching maritime legends and historical accounts of deep-sea encounters. If these creatures had been living in the ocean trenches for centuries, there might be records of previous encounters that predated modern government secrecy. The Miami Public Library's historical archives contained shipping records, naval reports, and maritime folklore dating back to the colonial period. Most of it was routine documentation of trade routes and weather patterns, but buried in the older records were accounts that made my blood run cold. 1847, British merchant vessel reported encountering massive tentacled beasts in deep Pacific waters. Crew members who survived described creatures of impossible size and evident intelligence before being dismissed as suffering from scurvy-induced hallucinations. 1923, Japanese fishing fleet discovered ancient bones of gigantic proportions in deep water nets. Government officials confiscated the specimens and classified the incident under national security protocols. 1952, U.S. Navy destroyer reported sonar contacts inconsistent with known marine life during deep water exercises. Official report classified the contacts as equipment malfunction, but crew members' personal letters described things moving in the depths that defied explanation. The pattern went back centuries, encounters with impossible creatures, followed by official dismissal and classification of evidence. Governments had been covering up the existence of these entities long before the Department of Oceanic Research started sending civilian divers down to document them. But the recent missions seemed different. Instead of accidentally encountering the creatures, the government was deliberately seeking them out, sending divers with experimental equipment to specific coordinates like they were conducting some kind of systematic study or negotiation. I thought about Kim's urgent questions during my dive, her insistence that I document everything, describe every interaction pattern, record every detail of the creature's behavior. They hadn't sent me down there to explore unknown territory. They'd sent me to gather intelligence about entities they already knew existed. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The Department of Oceanic Research wasn't just covering up the existence of these creatures. They were communicating with them, and divers like me were the messengers. 3 weeks into my surveillance routine, I noticed the patterns. The same dark sedan parked across from my apartment building every morning. The woman in the coffee shop who always seemed to be reading the same magazine. The maintenance worker who spent an unusual amount of time fixing things in my hallway. They weren't trying to be subtle anymore. Rodriguez's people wanted me to know I was being watched, probably hoping the constant observation would discourage any thoughts of going public with my story. But the surveillance also meant they were worried. If my memories were just trauma-induced hallucinations, why dedicate so many resources to monitoring one civilian diver? I started varying my routine, taking different routes to the grocery store and library, using cash instead of credit cards for purchases, not because I was planning anything dramatic, but because I wanted to see how they'd respond to changes in my behavior. The response was immediate. Rodriguez called the next morning, his voice carrying new tension. "Leroy, I've noticed some irregularities in your daily patterns. Are you experiencing increased anxiety or restlessness? Sometimes people in your situation develop paranoid thoughts about being watched." Paranoid thoughts. Right. Because noticing obvious surveillance was a symptom of mental illness rather than basic awareness. "I'm fine," I said. "Just trying to get more exercise, explore the neighborhood." "That's good to hear. But I want to remind you that maintaining routine can be very important for psychological stability during recovery. Sudden changes in behavior sometimes indicate that medication adjustments are needed." Medication adjustments, like increasing the dosage until I was too drugged to notice the surveillance or question their version of events. I'll keep that in mind. Excellent. I'm scheduling an additional check-in for this week. Wednesday at 2 p.m. Same location. I want to make sure you're getting the support you need. After he hung up, I sat in my sanitized apartment and considered my options. I could keep pretending to take their medication and submit to their monitoring until they decided I was no longer a threat. Live quietly on government money while they gradually erased any evidence that the creatures existed. Or I could find a way to prove that impossible things were living in the deepest parts of the ocean and that the government had been hiding them for decades. The smart choice was obvious. Take the money, keep quiet, and let someone else worry about underwater monsters and government cover-ups. But I kept thinking about Martinez and Fletcher, locked away in psychiatric facilities for refusing to deny what they'd seen, and about Dr. Chen's research, systematically suppressed whenever it got too close to the truth. How many other people had encountered evidence of these creatures over the years? How many had been silenced, discredited, or simply disappeared? I pulled out my hidden notebook and started planning. If I was going to expose the truth about what was living in those deep ocean trenches, I'd need more than just my own memories and a few historical accounts. I'd need proof that even the government couldn't deny or suppress, and I had an idea where to find it.